pro wrestling isn't always good. As a matter of fact, a lot of the time it could be pretty bad. But very rarely is it so monumentally terrible. And today I bear witness to such a rarity as I'm looking at what is considered to be by many the worst wrestling pay-per-view of all time. Now, going into this I thought that had to be an exaggeration, but coming out of this I'm realizing it was actually an understatement. Heroes of Wrestling was a one-off wrestling pay-per-view that was initially meant to continue on as a franchise, which is sort of made clear throughout the show when they're setting the groundwork for a sequel that will never come. Which is why, despite being billed as a Legends event, they still introduce relative newcomers to a wider audience, and make Captain Lou Albano the commissioner to a company that does not actually exist. The show is historically horrible, but before this review, I actually hadn't seen it, which is kind of surprising as anybody who knows me knows how much I love a dumpster fire. So join me in seeing if this lives down to expectations. A spoiler alert, it does, and it also sinks lower. This show is infamous for not being well thought out or, well. There are plenty of familiar faces here, though not all the names are the same due to copyright reasons. Sensational Sherry Martel is now Sensuous Sherry Martel. The former Bushwhackers are now called Men at Work. Too Cold Scorpio becomes Too Cold Scorpio. And Yokozuna becomes the former Yokozuna. That's it. That's his name. The former Yokozuna. Which I guess is factually correct. But you could have maybe followed that nickname up with his actual name? Like, if you were to call this man the former Yokozuna, that's an accurate description, but that's really only a moniker and not an actual name. What is he presently? When it comes to wrestling shows, there's a lot of room for error in your first outing, which is great for this show because it's got a whole lot of that and not a whole lot of anything else. Audio issues, bad camera work, crappy storylines, a commentator who doesn't know any of the moves but still feels inclined to call them like he does, and a ring announcer who doesn't seem to know what he's doing but is just real happy to be there. This has it all. With that in mind, let's see why this company's first show was also its last one. In the first matchup, it's a match of halves, as one half of the Rockers teams up with one half of the Fantastics to take on the Samoan SWAT team, which only consists of half that team. You see, despite being labeled as the Samoan SWAT team, this wasn't the Samoan SWAT team most fans were used to, as at the time, one half of the former Head Shrinkers, Fatu, was busting a move in WWF with Too Cool, so in his place was his brother, the former Tonga Kid. The three teamed up together in WCW previously, so it's not like this pairing was unwarranted. It just feels weird seeing the two together without him being billed as this, especially when the associated photo representing the team doesn't actually represent the team, because that's just a picture of the Head Shrinkers. Don't worry, even commentary gets confused as they continue to refer to the Samoan Savage as Fatu. The SWAT team makes their entrance alongside Wild Samoan Sika, but more attention is put on their manager for the night, Paul Adams. Adams proceeds to cut a promo that no one asked for that really does nothing for anybody aside from alerting the audience that they're the heels. He completely overshadows the team he's allegedly managing, with the spotlight being put on him. The cameras are much more focused on the guy talking rather than the two guys just standing there. And Sika is hardly ever mentioned on commentary and isn't even credited for this match in the promotional picture. The match is off to a slow start with both teams doing some crowd work, and it continues that way for a while. The pairing of Marty and Tommy feel really out of place together. Despite their history of being in tag teams, their inexperience as a tag team together definitely shows. Their work together feels sloppy, and the two sort of step on each other's toes all throughout. However, I think individually when those two aren't working together in this match, they both do a pretty solid job. While both men have impressive tag team resumes, together a dream team they are not. The Samoan SWAT team dismantles the offense pretty decisively. This match at times is a little sloppy and a little slow, but all things considered, it's, a match. It's not a great match, but honestly, it's not terrible. And by the end of the night, it's probably one of the best matches of the night. That doesn't speak for the quality of this match, but more so the quality of this show. It's a battle of the middle nicknames as George the Animal Steel takes on Greg the Hammer Valentine. Before the match, George Steele is shown walking around backstage with Sherry Martel, his new manager, until he decides to disrobe her? Okay. Cut to shortly thereafter, where Sherry talks up her latest acquisition, the animal. But when he shows up, she has to lure him away by lifting her dress up and walking off. Well, at least we know what his motivations are going into this match. Both men make their way to the ring, where George attempts to eat a turnbuckle, and Greg attempts to greet George's manager. Strangely enough, shortly into the match, Sherry turns on her client, choking him out and scratching at his eyes when he's blinded by his own shirt. Now that makes sense, as Sherry was primarily a heel during her run. She's best remembered for being at her worst. But what makes no sense is booking her as a face only to immediately turn her heel in the opening moments of a match. There's also this weird gimmick where because Steele was blinded, he didn't notice the betrayal, and instead trusts her with an object after the fact, which she then promptly hands over to the Hammer. The two trade blows with this unidentified object until eventually the Hammer gets the win. I don't know what happened with the finish here. It seems like they just repeated the same spot twice for some reason, but I can tell you I'm not a fan of it. As Valentine and Sherry celebrate their victory, the animal tosses the sensational one out of the ring. The heels make their exit as George throws chairs and eats a nearby turnbuckle. Then for some reason, Valentine returns to hit Steele with a steel chair, at which point the animal chases the Hammer back to the back. This match is a walk-in brawl without the benefit of being outside the ring. It's back and forth punches with very little else. It's a dud of a match with a strange story and an even more bizarre finish. I don't know if I can even call this a finish because it happened toward the beginning of the match. What a mistake. And I don't just mean the match. I mean, what a mistake in putting this together. What a mistake on my part for watching this. It's all bad. I would rather be doing anything else than going through the rest of this, but I will. Relative unknown Julio Fantastico, who feels misplaced at an event called Heroes of Wrestling, cuts a promo talking about being the best Too Cold Scorpio would ever face, and claiming that he'd never lose another match again. And it's not great. It's like a baby's first heel promo. You know, the guy's not exactly Dwayne Johnson here. But I'm willing to bet that this probably wasn't this guy at his all-time best. As a matter of fact, thus far, it feels like everybody on this card has been at their all-time worst. So I'm going to give this guy that same benefit of the doubt. Too Cold Scorpio enters with an accompanying photo of him being in his Flash Funk days, complete with his Funk University gear. Wouldn't that kind of be like advertising The Godfather with a picture of Papa Shango? Like, you're not wrong, but you're definitely not right. Too Cold Scorpio enters the ring carrying a WCW Championship replica, and I can't find any case of Too Cold Scorpio being a reigning champion anywhere at this point in time. So I guess he was just really psyched about his latest toy store purchase. During the match, wrestling legend, real-life Super Mario, and Cyndi Lauper's dad, Captain Lou Albano, comes out to join commentary. He has a couple fun quips, but mostly he just does his best to be a spokesperson for the show, and regurgitates lines from his past promos with half the passion he once had. The two wrestlers go back and forth, flipping through a chain, and it's not bad. As a matter of fact, the two combat each other's attacks pretty well. The two trade drop kicks and arm drags all throughout the match. These guys have unique styles, and it's interesting to see them work together. Although admittedly, at times it can look like they're working in slow motion. Like the first match, it does come off a little bit sloppy. There's a bunch of botches and mistimed spots, including the match's climax, which they even replay in slow motion for some reason. Speaking strictly as a spectator, it does seem like Julio was a little wet behind the ears at the time. I don't think I've ever seen somebody run the ropes like that, but he showed a lot of promise. Even Captain Lou on commentary seems to speak on his inexperience.
Throughout a couple of years of experience, he'll keep progressing to that point. Right now, let's put him on 100%. I'd give him like an 80-85.
That doesn't make sense.
Despite this, he showed a lot of promise. Regardless, the match certainly has its moments, with the two countering each other in interesting ways, and flying through the air with the greatest of ease. They make their way outside the ring and into the crowd, taking out a couple of kids in the process. The former Flash Funk gets the victory with a flying miss in an alright match, for the show that it's a part of. Afterward, Captain Lou Albano is made the Commissioner of Heroes of Wrestling, as previously mentioned, and then King Kong Bundy cuts a promo on his opponent, not Yokozuna. Nothing of importance really happens in either segment, so we move on to our next match. A classic tag team match between two classic tag teams, as the former Bushwhackers, the men from down under, Luke and Butch, take on the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, with their manager, Nikita Brenzanov. I am probably mispronouncing that. Interesting thing to note, for some reason Luke and Butch share a picture, but they needed two separate pictures of the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov. I don't know, it's not very aesthetically pleasing. And speaking of not being aesthetically pleasing, everything in this match. The match starts off on a low note, as the two teams don't ever seem to find a rhythm and just sort of bump into each other all throughout, taking some of the more bizarre bumps I think I've ever seen in wrestling. It's not great. It's clear that for one reason or another, whether it be due to age or injury, and probably a mixture of both, that not everyone in the ring was in ring shape. The two teams are very lightly landing each other on the mat. The offense is so light, as a matter of fact, that both teams hardly remember to sell. The crowd is over the match as soon as it begins, as they remain silent all throughout. There's some fun character work with the Iron Sheik threatening to leave the match if the crowd continued to chant USA, but no amount of smoke and mirrors can disguise this for the blatantly bad bout that it is. Even calling it a match sort of feels like slander to pro wrestling. It was a mistake, like the rest of this show has been. This is pretty horrendous, and despite the best effort of all those involved, pretty hard to watch. The match ends with Volkov hitting one of the used-to-be Bushwhackers before accidentally nailing his partner with the unidentified foreign object so that the legal man from down under could get the pin. Did you understand what I meant with that sentence? Because I watched this and I said it and I still have no idea what I just said and what I just witnessed. After the match, Sheik and Volkov tease a falling out before hugging it out and continuing on, because they have many more bottom-of-the-barrel bad indie shows to attend. Up next, the former Four Horsemen takes on a former Midnight Expresser. Tully Blanchard goes one-on-one with Stan Lane. Before the match, an angle ensues where we see the Pinnacle's manager jumped in the parking lot by Ric Flair's protege. Later, Tully cuts a pretty great promo, showcasing his skills as one of the most underrated talkers in the history of the game. He talks about his issues with Stan Lane, and compares it to the same hatred he's had for his greatest rivals. He says he'll take on his opposition with all the anger he's had for all of them combined. The promo is way too good for the show that it's a part of. In just a little over 3 minutes, Tully manages to make this match feel important, which is no easy feat when something is being billed as a grudge match, but they've only just now found out about this alleged grudge. Sweet Stan Lane comes down to the ring to cut a standard heel promo, talking himself up by down-talking his opponent, even going so far as to give his own in-ring introduction. Add on to it that he's rocking a short blonde sting cut, and he really just comes off like Mr. Kennedy's dad. Stan continues to insult Tully as he makes his entrance, causing one half of the Brainbusters to rush to the ring. This is a very old school bout between two old school guys. It's kind of what you'd expect. There's a couple of strange bumps taken throughout. The match definitely gets relatively rough, both for the two involved and the people having to watch it, with the fans who were invested eventually just giving up. In an effort to make up for the lack of audience participation, the commentators discuss the fans being mesmerized, while the camera continues to cut to fans looking far more concerned with anything else. The match eventually ends in a pretty confusing way. So confusing that commentator Dutch Mantell has to explain to his fellow commentator what actually caused the finish and who it was that won. Stan Lane was allegedly cradling Tully for a pin, not realizing that his shoulders were on the mat. So he was also being counted for the pin. So both men were being counted for a double pin, except Tully kicked out at 2. Why? Who did this benefit? What an awful ending to an already awful match. This match got my hopes up and then immediately reminded me what show I was watching. Now look, say what you will about the actual quality of the match itself, it's not the best effort either man has ever put forward. I think that's pretty obvious. But they managed to tell a story both before and during their match. They made it matter if even for a couple of minutes. You know, this was must-see until it was actually seen. Whatever goodwill it drummed up, it lost it in the end. Not great, but definitely not the worst that I've seen on the card, and definitely not the worst that there is to be seen on this card. After the match, we go to the back to get a promo from Jim the Anvil Neidhart and King Kong Bundy, who are now aligned for reasons we'll get into later. Hardcore fans rejoice. Legends Abdullah the Butcher and One Man Gang have a match that's gonna wind up getting this video demonetized. But essentially, imagine a big brawl with a lot of bleeding from both parties, which is always a little bit uncomfortable to watch, but is especially uncomfortable to watch in hindsight, for obvious reasons. What makes matters worse is that the blood literally gets everywhere. I mean, it is all over the place. They get up close and personal with the crowd, with the commentary table. It's also another match with a really weird finish, as after 8 minutes of the two bashing each other with all kinds of weapons, the match is suddenly called off due to a double countout. So you're in a hardcore match, but the ring out isn't turned off? Okay, seems weird to me, but you know what? Nothing about tonight has felt normal, so let's just continue. The penultimate match sees the Superfly take on the Cowboy. Again, we get an angle before the match, and that angle is from above, as we see some surveillance footage of Bob Orton, Lou Albano, and Jimmy Snuka gambling at the casino, until ultimately it's revealed that good old Ace was cheating. A brawl breaks out, and a match is set. Both men plead their case. In Snuka's case, Captain Lou does it for him.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
The match is exactly what you'd expect from these two past their prime stars. It's plagued with timing issues and mistakes. You know, it's not bad when you compare it to everything else in the show. It's a classic wrestling match that at the very least is watchable. I don't think this match is going to go down in history as the reason anyone ever got into wrestling, but it's a competent match performed by two great performers of their generation. They still do what they do well, for the most part. At this point in time, Superfly could still make you believe a man could fly, and Bob Orton could still make you believe that he could crush a man like a fly. Overall, I think the match's biggest sin is just having it go on for a little bit too long. At some point, it just stops being fun. They get the crowd going, but then the crowd wants to up and leave. Snuka gets the win after an aerial assault, at which point the crowd starts chanting at Bob Orton. I can't tell you what they're calling him, but let's just say it's not a maggot. Next up is another battle between two middle nicknames, as the Snake takes on the Anvil. Fitting for a show of this caliber, the main event remains the low point of the show. This is the worst at its worst. And before getting into the debacle that was this finale, I think it's only fair to acknowledge that the man we're about to talk about was in the midst of addiction and at one of the lowest points of his life, which thankfully so is not a representation of who the man is today. At this point in time, Jake the Snake's successful rehab stint was the talk of the town. So this show was looking to capitalize off his sober star power, but unfortunately, there was no sobriety to speak of here. Shortly before the show, Roberts would relapse in a big way. Before his match even began, he gave audiences a taste of what was to come as he drunkenly slurred his way through his promo. But man, even at his worst, this guy was one of the best. Even when he's more focused on playing with his hair like he's just suddenly discovered that he had it, he still knows how to speak. Though he is struggling to. I'm not saying that this was a good promo, but it's kind of crazy how charismatic this man could be when intoxicated. It's like he had the idea of a good promo, he wasn't in the right state of mind to deliver it. Luckily, years later he'd get a chance to do just that. Neidhart comes down to the ring already looking pretty uneased. And then Jake the Snake makes his way down the ramp. And then Jake the Snake makes his way back up the ramp. And then Jake the Snake makes his way down the ramp again. The audience comes to life upon his appearance, but he's clearly not in-ring ready. The man is on planets that haven't even been discovered yet, hanging onto the ropes to keep himself steady, and working incredibly sluggishly as he staggers around the ring. He actually almost steps on his pet snake a couple of times here. Neidhart tries to work a match around his inebriated opponent, but it's to no avail. Eventually, Jake resorts to whipping out a snake a few times and jerking it around like it's not a snake. And then he starts tonguing it down, and I don't know what message he's trying to send here, but I know I don't like it. Neidhart rushes out of the ring and feigns fear. but literally can't stop giggling at Jake's antics. And this is when all hell breaks loose. Without rhyme or reason, King Kong Bundy makes his way down to ringside to talk with Jim Neidhart. The big man stands at ringside watching the anvil wrestle the human equivalent of an actual anvil, as Jim could barely get Jake on his feet. Roberts eventually briefly gets the upper hand, and even forces a camera cut after he flips off the opposition. Bundy finally involves himself in the match when the former Yokozuna slowly makes his way down the ramp. Jake stumbles out of the ring as the heels battle the babyface Yokozuna, and during said beatdown, it's announced that this is now a tag team match. Following the announcement, out comes a little bald guy who the commentators begin to speculate is, in their words, a little Bundy. So they start referring to him as Little Bundy, though the fans chant Uncle Fester at him. In actuality, this man's name was Michael Henry, and this wasn't even the first time we'd see this guy on our screens, as earlier he served as the chauffeur for Tully Blanchard, and then again as security trying to bring One Man Gang and Abdullah the Butcher to the back. He's now apparently playing the role of heel manager, yelling at fans, whispering in the ears of the bad guys, and even choking out Jake the Snake Roberts during the match. But this man was not a manager. Even if his sudden appearance wasn't a tip-off to his inexperience, the awkwardness he carries himself with should be a dead giveaway. Call this man Donnie because he's out of his element. He was just a ring crew hand that was sacrificed in an effort to save the show. Though I think it was clear to most sound-minded individuals that at this stage, that was a lost cause. The decision to turn this into a tag team match was a split-second decision made in an effort to work around Jake. Yet despite all these last-minute changes to a product that was already in production, they still allowed him to remain in the ring most of the time. Jake is stripped of his shoes as the two heels take turns beating a man while he's already down. Finally, Jake tags out of the ring, and shortly thereafter, despite not actually being the legal man, he takes the pin. The heels walk off as their impromptu manager is taken hostage by the faces, and Yokozuna gets the crowd to chant DDT in preparation for Jake to hit his finish. A finish which will never come because Jake was too out of it to even know what was going on at this point, causing Yoko to instead hit this poor guy with a pretty painful looking Samoan drop. At which point, Jake then lets Damien crawl all over him to send the fans home deeply confused. Yokozuna helps Jake the Snake up off the ground, and the feed cuts. And that was Heroes of Wrestling, a villain of the industry. I can see why this is considered the worst of the worst. This was an all-time low for wrestling as a whole, but one that seemed to be put together under good intentions. If you like this video and want to see me cover more wrestling shows here on the channel, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Wrestling's not fake! I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.